reason. Oh, Tart's back. Reza Aslan is our guest. Tart, I know you've been a big fan for a long time. Tart, can you hear me?
I can. I lost connection for just a moment there. So, welcome everyone to our special episode of Royal Rumble. We are joined tonight by someone I've been a fan of for years and years now, Reza Aslan. I'm super excited to have the opportunity to meet him and talk with him. Don, do you want to go ahead and bring him on?
Yes.
Let's do it.
How you doing, Reza?
I'm doing all right. It's nice to be here with you guys.
Hey there,
I'm
Reza.
sorry about
It's a
last
pleasure
time.
to meet you.
Anybody who doesn't know, I screwed up the timing last time and didn't show up. So
That's all right. Sometimes those things happen.
At least you're here now. We're excited to have you on now. It was a lot like being stood up on a date. Both Don and I were together reminiscing. We were kind of crying a little bit on the stream, going like,
yeah, thinking about all those.
we thought you
girls
just didn't want to talk to us.
I get it. I've had that feeling.
It's a pleasure to meet you, though, and I'm excited. I'm excited. So I want to get started with kind of talking a little bit about religion in a general sense. I know you've had some changes over time with your religious perspective and views, and religion has been, a hot topic with you since the beginning of your major, at least your crowd focused career. That's always been like the big contention. Where are you at? I read somewhere that you switched to Christianity. I read somewhere that you switched back to Islam, and I'm going like, okay, I just want to clear where are you at? What are you now?
So people may be unfamiliar with what I do. I basically write about and talk about religion and politics, which means I get yelled at a lot, basically. My own kind of religious journey, I was born in Iran to a kind of culturally Muslim family, the way that so many people are culturally religious. It was just kind of part of our identity. After the revolution in 1979, my family fled Iran and came to the United States. And my dad, who was never really religious to begin with, in fact, he was kind of a very anti-religious person, just kind of used that as an excuse to scrub our lives of religion. But it's funny because I always as a child had a deep fascination with religion and spirituality and mythology. I think, again, partly it was my experience of revolutionary Iran. I got to see firsthand the power that religion has to transform a society for good and for bad. And I think that it never left me. And so, but I never really had any opportunity to kind of explore it, at home. When I was in high school, I went to an evangelical youth group called Young Life, which some people might be familiar with. It's kind of like a high school missionary group. And I heard the gospel story for the first time. And it was an incredible story. I mean, there's a reason why it's called the greatest story ever told. It's an amazing story. And I almost immediately converted to this very particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity. And then when I went to college, I decided that I was going to study religion for a living. I always wanted to be a writer, but I come from an immigrant family, so that's not a conversation that you can have with your immigrant mom and dad who left everything behind in order to give you a better life. That I'm going to be a writer. I remember very clearly. I told my mother I was going to be a writer, and she said, "Who's stopping you from writing? You can go be a doctor, and then you can just write." And I said, "No. I want to like do it for a living." And she goes, "That's not a thing. That's not that's not a thing." And so I thought, okay, well, I'll become a professor, and then that'll allow me to write. And I'm really fascinated by religion.
And at the same time, you're also placating, your Middle Eastern parents from Persia. You're a doctor, you're a professor, and you get to write.
My mother, to this day, ever since my PhD, to this day, my mother still introduces me as Dr. Reza, as though I could help anyone do anything. Like, I can't help you. I mean, unless you...
But it's still great. I mean, hey, look, you spent a lot of time in school to earn that doctor. I'm just if I had a doctorate, you'd be calling me doctor. Sorry, thank you.
And listen, if you need someone to like parse, the vowel markings on an Akkadian manuscript, I'm your doctor.
Yeah. I don't think very many people have that problem.
Yeah, that's pretty much all I'm good for. But I did have like this kind of incredible experience at university when I started studying religion, and particularly the New Testament. I've said this before, but I had two profound realizations. Number one, everything that I thought I knew about Jesus was wrong. Like everything that I had been taught uh, was wrong. And there was this kind of other Jesus, this historical Jesus, this Jewish peasant, who was preaching Judaism to other Jews, which I was introduced to and was just immediately fascinated by, and that kind of led me to reject some of the evangelical Christianity that I had been following at the time. And then the second thing that I discovered was kind of what religion actually is. And this is a much harder, much broader topic, but I think most people think that religion is faith, that they mean the same thing. And people do this all the time. Like, I believe in Christianity, I believe in Islam. Like, those are things to believe in rather than things that point you to the thing to believe in. And uh, I kind of had this, recognition that religion in the end is just kind of the language that we use to describe faith, which is, mysterious and personal and fundamentally in emotion. And it doesn't really matter what language you use. It's just like, if, what's the difference between French and German? I mean, you're saying the same thing. And so I was encouraged to kind of look at some of the language of Islam that I had grown up with, which I had completely forgotten about. And the more I did, the more kind of it just felt better to me. It wasn't more right. It wasn't more correct. That's not really a thing when it comes to religion. It just, the metaphors and the symbols that Islam, and particularly Sufi Islam, which is the branch that I associate with, um, felt more sort of comfortable, more in tune with the way that I thought about the universe and God and my place in the world and all of that stuff.
Why do you think then that so many religious scholars and religious thinker apologists do argue which one is more correct if religion is not about that?
Well, there's two kinds of religion scholars. Let's just be clear. First of all, the study of religion itself falls into two categories. There's theology, which is the study of God, and that is not what I do. And then there's religious studies, which is the historical, anthropological, archaeological, study of religion. Like, you take the religious experience of humanity going all the way back, to the dawn of Homo sapiens, actually further back, and you try to trace the origins of it, the elements of it, the sociological impact of it, the history of it. My particular interest when it comes to the study of religions is about origins. So I'm really fascinated about sort of where, particular religions came from, like how did Judaism arise and where did Islam come from and how did Christianity become what it is. But I'm also deeply fascinated in the larger question of, like, where the hell did religion come from? Like, how did all of this thing start? And is it something that's out there or is it something that's in here? Those are the questions that I tackle. But there are people who, of course, study religion, not theology, but study it from a very specific point of view, which is, I'm a Christian and I'm going to spend my life studying and writing about why Christianity is correct, et cetera, et cetera. And I've had my run-ins with those folks.
I'm curious.
Doesn't go well usually.
You mentioned that there's a difference between the sort of Jesus that we're taught about, and then there's the historic Jesus.
Yeah.
Can you dig into that topic a little bit with me? What are some of the major differences between those two beings? And is it actually important which one you believe in? Do you believe in this sort of version of Jesus that we're sold, or is it better to believe in this sort of historic figure?
Well, that's a good question. Well, let's start with the first thing. So the differentiation that I use is the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. And these are two radically different people, right? The Christ of faith is a kind of ethereal, celestial being who is timeless and eternal who's not of this world, who is God incarnate, as he sort of eventually becomes labeled as, who whose every word is spoken to all of us for all time, whose every action is not sort of specific to his time and place, but eternal and everlasting, and who fundamentally has no concern for the things of this world. That's the Christ of faith, and that is the person that billions of people around the world worship, and for whom hundreds of millions of people believe is, the incarnate version of God. The Jesus of history was, as I mentioned before, a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews. That's who he was. He was an illiterate, uneducated, when I was about to say poor, but poor doesn't really begin to describe how poor Jesus actually was. Jesus was what is called a tekton in Greek, which is like an artisan or a day laborer. So when I try to explain to people, like, if you want to know kind of what Jesus's job was, go to Home Depot. You see the guys hanging out in the parking lot waiting for a truck to pick them up and get them to like haul stuff for a few dollars. That
was Jesus.
That was his work. That was his job. A tekton or an artisan, their job, they were day laborers. They would go around looking for things to build, things to fix. They would work, day wages. They'd get their wages and they'd go home. In fact, the Romans used the word tekton as a swear word. So Jesus's occupation was a swear word for Romans. So I just want to emphasize, because people are like, Jesus was poor. I don't think you understand what we mean when we say poor. And yet, this is a man who, because of his charisma and the power of his teachings, managed to gather a movement to him, a very short-lived movement, but a movement nonetheless, that the Roman Empire, the greatest, most powerful empire the world had ever known, thought was such a threat to them that they hunted him down, arrested him, tortured him, and executed him for the crime of treason against the state. Now, to your second question, does it matter which one of these you worship? No, it doesn't. But think about what I just told you. Think about the biography of the man that I just told you. Don't call him Jesus. Let's call him Fred, shall we? And Fred is an impossibly poor, uneducated, illiterate peasant from the backwoods of Galilee who started a movement that so threatened the greatest empire the world had ever known that he was arrested and executed for treason. Don't you want to know that person?
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. Like, exactly. You're literally saying this, arguably the most famous man in history, who terrified the most powerful empire in history, was basically Fred down at Home Depot. That's a really hilarious way to put this.
I mean, when I discovered that the Jesus of history, this was the guy that I had been looking for. I mean,
yet you still went to like Sufism, right? To the Sufism branch of Islam. Why? Because I feel like Muhammad's historical story is very different than Jesus' historical story.
Somewhat. I would say the big difference between Muhammad's story and Jesus' story is that Muhammad was successful in his lifetime, whereas Jesus wasn't. Muhammad was also a poor orphan from a unknown clan, he was, essentially running a caravan for wealthy people. Like, his job was, he was like a porter, essentially, who had this religious experience, couldn't read or write, was illiterate, was uneducated, yet with his charisma gathered a bunch of people together, all this sounding familiar, and challenged what was in his world, in the Arabian Peninsula, the most powerful tribe, a tribe called Quraysh, that basically controlled everything, controlled the politics, controlled the land, controlled the money. And then in his lifetime, not right before he died, he managed to actually defeat the Quraysh, and he and his group, uh, you know, became the dominant group in the peninsula. Really, honestly, the big difference between Muhammad and Jesus is that one of them lived to see his success, and the other one didn't.
Okay, and I'm curious because you mentioned before you had said that essentially religion is it's a language, and so I'm
Mhm.
curious what the relationship between the language that we're talking about is, and what is it? One, like what is it actually doing? So, like the way I view language is as a tool for communication that allows us to facilitate interaction with one another. Right? That's the role of the
That's
language. So,
right.
my first question is, what's the role of religion? And then the second question there, what's the role of these sort of religious figures like Jesus in that language in that language? What
Yeah.
can you kind of flesh that out for me?
Yeah, these are really fantastic questions. So think about it this way. You're right. Language is meant as a form of communication. What are you communicating when you're speaking? You're communicating your thoughts, you're communicating emotions, right? There are some emotions that are extraordinarily difficult to put into words. And so we have a whole slew of metaphors and similes and symbols, symbolic language that we use in order to speak in these terms. So, if like I was going to say, like, if your heart is broken, but that right there, that's a symbolic way. And when I say my heart was broken, everybody who is listening knows exactly what I mean by that, because everyone has felt that. And we have a set of languages, a set of phrases, and etc., that we can use, that I can communicate with you this incredibly deep, personal, hard to put into words emotion by using a phrase that you completely understand. That's religion. But in this case, the emotion is even harder to explain. The emotion is faith. The emotion is this biological impulse, and that's a other whole other fascinating aspect about it, is how much of this is evolutionary and biological. Is this biological impulse, this uh, yearning for a feeling of transcendence, right? An idea to sort of experience the thing that is beyond. We all have this. We're all born with it. It's kind of a product of our cognitive processes. Why? That's a whole other issue. But the point being that to express this thing requires a kind of symbolic language. And especially if you want to communicate it with other like minded people, you need a way to talk about this. And religion began as that way. It began as a set of metaphors and symbols, symbolic language, symbolic expressions, actions that allowed a like minded community to communicate with each other the ineffable experience of this kind of transcendence, the ineffable experience of being human, frankly. Um, and so when you talk about, when I was talking about what Jesus is, what the Christ of faith is, that's a metaphor, right? So
Okay.
the sort of primary metaphor for God, which again is this kind of undefinable thing, like what the hell are you talking about, God? What does that even mean? Well, we need some metaphors to explain what we mean by that. The primary metaphor in Christianity for God is man, us. What is God? Just imagine the most perfect man you could possibly think of. Perfectly
Okay.
kind, perfectly generous, perfectly compassionate, no faults whatsoever. That's what God is. Now, that's a very successful metaphor, because that's a very easy thing for people to think about. Like, what is God? Well, just imagine yourself, but a perfect version of yourself. That's a very powerful metaphor. The metaphor for Sufi Islam, which is what Dandan was bringing up, why Sufi Islam, the metaphor for God in Islam, and actually also in Judaism, it's the same exact metaphor. The metaphor for God in those terms is oneness, divine, like the concept of
Divine unity,
oneness, right?
oneness. Yeah.
Both Judaism and Islam, the profession of faith in Judaism, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. In Islam, there is no God but God. They're both statements not of monotheism, but they're both statements of what God is. God is oneness. What is God is unity in its fundamental sense.
I do like this for like
And God is, by the way,
the
I just want to say, God is the opposite of human in Islam and
yes, I
Judaism.
agree. I mean, I have a Jewish background. I grew up kind of Orthodox, but
There you
I
go.
feel like you're pulling away religion from its political, social, and governmental aspects that it had throughout history. Right? We know like early Jewish writings and religion wasn't entirely separate from the idea of the people of Israel creating a national identity against the other states around them. Um,
Well,
Ending
that's
away with the actions of like idol worship, and I think Islam and
mhm.
Christianity in a way do that as well. um, why is it then that you just call it a language when language is it's much more than simply how we communicate? It also bears constitutional power if we look at like the way theologies worked back in the past.
Right, right. Which is why, first of all, just to real quick, if you follow the biblical conception, um, and you see Abraham as sort of the beginning of what is now referred to as Judaism, it was many, many centuries before that became in any way, shape, or form tied to the land of Israel. Abraham was a Canaanite. He lived in Ur. So he was, it was a completely different
Sure, yeah, because
thing.
we
But
know
anyway,
the Torah historically was compiled like
yeah,
500
of course,
BC.
of course.
It
Yeah,
wasn't completed
I know. I just
1200
like
BC. Yeah,
it's my thing. I gotta
yeah,
I gotta just kind
okay,
of
okay, okay.
add that little thing to it. So of course, the second you start formulating this language, this sort of, and it's got to be systematic, right? It immediately lends itself to control. Who controls this language? Who provides the metaphors? Who defines the metaphors? Who can decide who is doing it right and who is not? Who is us and who is them? What is the institution that around which the power of this language gets consolidated? Who gets to do the consolidating? So when I talk about language, I always make sure that I emphasize that it's an institutionalized form of language, right? The
Okay.
religion is fundamentally about in groups and out groups and control. And so it's very easy to see how that impulse towards transcendence requires a means of communicating it, and then that means of communication very quickly undergoes control and in institutionalization, and then of course you have power structures. That's just how every ideology falls into that trap. So we shouldn't be surprised that religion does too. But fundamentally, what is religion? How did it arise? These are the questions that I'm talking about.
I think basically anyone can see that religion is definitely a communal, like it's a communal feature. Like, what do we all do on Sunday? Well, where I grew
Yeah.
up, we all get up and we all go to church, and so there's absolutely this communal feature to it. I would also say that probably this is it sounds like the probably the most nuanced version of religion I've ever encountered in my entire life. I'm an atheist, and I think that when I say an atheist, I mean I don't believe that there is this deity out there. I don't believe there's a God, right? Um, but when you say if you were talking to an atheist, it would be something like they don't have a language to communicate certain emotions. Would
Not
that be an
no,
would that be an accurate description, or
no,
how do you handle
not
that
at all.
topic?
Well, so two things. Um, just like everything else, atheism requires defining, right? Because people understand it in multiple different ways. There was a fantastic Pew Forum on religion and public life poll that came out. I want to say maybe at this point, like maybe 12 years ago, um, that indicated that upwards of 20% of all self-described atheists believe in a higher power. So you said something very interesting. You said, I'm an atheist, which means I don't believe in God. Well, is that what it really means? Because again, what do you mean by God? God is just a word. It's just a word. And it's probably the most variable word in the entire English language. And yet, ironically, it's also the word that we all throw around, assuming that when I say God, I mean the same thing that you mean when you say God, or that when he says God, when in reality, we are most definitely meaning completely different things. There, fundamentally, when someone says that they're an atheist, more or less what they mean is that they're a materialist. That's what they mean. What they mean is, remember that thing that I was talking about before? That biological evolutionary impulse to strive towards the thing that is beyond, the thing that is beyond the material world? An atheist would say there is no thing beyond the material world. It is just the material world. That's what exists. And there isn't this kind of transcendent reality on the other side of this. And you can call that transcendent reality God if you want to. You can call it Buddha nature if you want to. You can call it chi if you want to. You can call it prana if you want to. You can call it whatever the hell you want to, but fundamentally what you mean is that there is this thing that is real, and that is that you can experience it, you can know it, and it exists beyond the material realm.
I mean, I when I say I'm an atheist, I usually mean it within a Jewish context. That's what I grew up in. I kind of make a distance between myself and those who believe that God literally gave Moses rocks on top of the mountain. Well, I can also
Not
recognize
religious.
like the Brahmin notions of God as the unknown, or God as a yearning towards transcendence. I can understand that, but most people don't mean God by that. So why
Most
make
people
this
don't think about it
this
enough.
distinction? Well,
See,
That's actually a good point. Most people don't
yeah,
think about this topic.
most people don't think
What
about
is
it.
God to begin with? Like,
That's why this poll was so fascinating, because people will instinctively just when they really mean to say is that I'm not religious. That's what they really mean to say. Like, I'm not interested in religion. I'm not religious. It's not a thing that I care about. They will sometimes just sort of instinctively say I'm an atheist. And what was again fascinating about this poll is that they started asking certain questions. Oh, you're an atheist. Okay, well, let me ask you some questions. Like, do you think this? Do you think that? Etc. Etc. And in those questions, the people had to kind of really think about what that really meant to say, I'm an atheist. Now, by the way, a lot of people aren't even I'm saying that there are people who are atheists who are just like flat out materialists and who absolutely do not believe in any kind of supernatural sort of idea or power. And on top of that, also are like against religion as an idea or an impulse. And those people are anti-theists, not atheists. So
sure.
again, this is the problem with academics, is that we're constantly trying to define, right? Like, so just be careful. Like, really think about how you think about it.
Well,
Are you
when
a,
you when you
I'm not a physicalist myself. I'm like metaphysically agnostic. I take an agnostic position. I think that physicalism is more probable than some of the other positions. Like, I would outright reject something like a dualist system, but I think idealism is compelling for its like parsimony and things like that. But it seems like, and there is this new aged atheism that I find really strange. The lack theist view, the sort of I find it a very peculiar view, because
yeah,
my interest is primarily in philosophy, and in philosophy, atheism is like saying the proposition God exists is false, right? That proposition, it's just false. God does not exist, um, and so that's how it's standardly defined. I'm just not understanding how it's defined in this linguistic form, where there's a language behind it.
right.
That's primarily what I'm curious. What would atheism, in
So,
the context of
right.
this linguistic feature that you have
Very
about
good.
religion, how does that
Very
work?
good. Oh, go ahead. And I'm sorry, Dan, were you gonna?
I was just gonna piggyback just afterwards. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, look, if you believe, and a number of scholars actually talk about this a lot, and very smart people, that atheism is fundamentally a belief system because it is predicated on a set of postulates about the function of the universe that are neither provable or disprovable, and so in many ways are kind of fundamentally relying on a similar kind of well, again, I'm not, by the way, I'm not saying that like atheists and Christians are the same. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that that atheism can function very much, and it often does, especially a lot of the new atheist movement, function as a belief system. And it uses the same kinds of language. You used some of that yourself when you were talking about physicalism and materialism versus non-materialism and things like that. That nevertheless have that same kind of um, sort of what's the word I'm looking for? The same power to sort of unite two individuals or a community of individuals around a shared set of assumptions about how the universe works and our place in it. And one can say, yeah, but the difference is that with atheism, those are true assumptions. Okay, all right. I mean, that's what the Christian would say, but okay. To me, I think that fundamentally, it comes down to kind of three basic questions, right? At its core. Question number one, we've kind of hinted at a little bit. Do you believe that there is something beyond the material realm, something real, something knowable, not like a sense or a feeling, but something real, something that can be known and experienced? Number one, do you believe that? If no, great, you're a materialist, you're an atheist, go about your day. You're probably happier than the rest of us, frankly. If the answer is yes, then the second question is, do you want to know that thing? Do you actually want to experience it in some way? Do you want to feel it? If the answer is no, okay, then you're an agnostic, basically, which I know a lot of people think means an agnostic is somebody who doesn't know, but really an agnostic, when you really get down to it, is somebody who doesn't care. That's what agnostic means. It's like, it's not a thing for me. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. Who gives a shit? It's not part of my life. But let's say your answer is yes. Yeah, I do want to experience that thing. Then the third question is how? Just pick a path. You can make your own path, blaze your own path. But the Buddha once said that if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells, you dig 1 6-foot well. Pick a well and start digging, and maybe you'll reach
so why
water.
Sufism? So why did you choose to dig in the well of Sufism? Because you said it's a shared language. I understand that, right? So, like, for example, you learn to speak French, and now you're a part of the community of people who speak French, and the similar idea, the way the grammar works. Why Sufism, right? Like,
Yeah.
you definitely know the difference between the way you probably believed in God when you were a teenager to the way you think about God now.
Absolutely.
So, in for most people who are just beginning this journey, would look and you'd be like, well, you don't literally believe God gave Moses rocks on the mountain. Do you literally believe that Muhammad, split the moon in half or whatever it might be? Does that even matter to you? Is that even important to you? Why is it not important?
Well, because I know what a myth is. A myth
Okay.
is not, first of all, myth, unfortunately, in the modern parlance has come to mean falsehood. That's not the definition of myth. That's the connotation of myth. The denotation of myth is simply stories about gods and goddesses that carry some moral message. And myths in that definition are always true, because their truth has nothing to do with the facts that they convey. Their truths are buried in the story itself. So the question, did Moses really get those rocks from God, is just a dumb question, because you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't did he or didn't he? The question is, what is that story conveying? What truth about the very nature of the divine in this particular religious tradition and our relationship to the divine in this tradition? What does it mean? What is that the truth that is conveyed by that message? To your much more important, I think more fascinating question, why Sufi Islam, it goes back to the discussion about metaphors that we were talking about. We said that in Judaism and in Christianity, and in Islam, the fundamental metaphor, the fundamental symbol for God is this concept of oneness. And that's always been the case. It's been the case from the very beginning. However, there are movements in both of those religious traditions that have really taken that concept to its logical limit. which is that if God is one, then there's no division of God. And if there's no division of God, if there's no dividing the divine unity, then everything is God. Nothing can be that isn't God. If God is fundamentally, if the very substance of God is oneness, if his substance is creation, then nothing can be created that isn't also God. Sufis call this tawheed, and the idea behind it is that if you think of God as an ocean, then every drop of water is everything that exists. You cannot exist except insofar as you share in the existence of the only thing that exists.
So in
And
that
that
vein,
to
why
me,
not Judaism? Right.
was that
So in that vein, why not Judaism? Because I know Judaism says the
honestly,
same thing.
oh,
So
absolutely, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
why not identify as both? Why not, like, because I think Tar and I spoke the other time that you kind of take a pluralist view of religion. So why not both? Why identify? Say, oh, I'm a Sufi Muslim. It's not to,
Yeah,
oh, I'm a pluralist who is this, and why that specific identity marker?
because it's the well that helps me reach the water. And it makes no difference. I mean, I've lived with Orthodox Jewish communities. My son identifies as Jewish. We go to temple. We celebrate at least the high holy days. My wife is Christian. We go to church because that's her well. What my family understands and what the Buddha understands is that it doesn't matter which well you choose. What matters is the water. And what's important to understand is that regardless of the well, we're all drinking the same water. And so in my household, it makes no difference. Why did I choose Sufi Islam? Because I gravitated towards it. It like there's the metaphors and the teachings and the people drew me to it. But insofar as like as I was talking before, like, is it better? Is it like more right? Those are not proper
Those are
questions.
not things you care about.
Well, they're not even proper questions when it comes to religion.
Okay.
They're not the right
So
question.
some of what you said here, like I said, I do think this is a very nuanced view. But I think a lot of your critics might say that this has an air of Jordan Peterson style to it when it comes to
Oh,
religion. He's got
ah,
a
no,
very different. I know I hurt your feelings. I'm
no,
sorry. I still love you.
oh my
I still
God.
love you. I
I've
still
never
love
been
you.
called that in my life, but okay, go ahead.
But
Go ahead.
but Jordan Peterson does do this very elaborate dance with religion, and I think
Mm.
everyone has kind of seen the sort of despite I admit that his view is nuanced. It's still like this elaborate dance. How do you respond to some of the people who are on the opposite end of this? Someone like Sam Harris would say, "This just all seems like BS to me. It just straight up sounds like you're dancing around the topic, and that we're not talking about what we're trying to talk about." How would you respond to that that kind of very
Yeah.
direct person who's like, "Hey, I'm
I
talking
don't
about this
want it
being
to.
that
I
really
don't want it to
exists."
come off. I know how this can come off, but uh, I've spent my entire life studying this topic. I didn't come up with it on the toilet. You mentioned
Yeah,
Sam Harris. I don't argue uh, cognitive theory with Sam Harris because he's a cognitive scientist. Right? Like, I think this is weird because I think, and Sam, we've had many public debates about this,
I
but
know.
I always find it very funny because they're like, well, Sam is an expert on cognitive science because he went to school and he spent his, adult life studying this topic and this discipline, and so he's an expert on it. Uh, but you just know about religion, and that's not real. I mean, I've spent 30 years studying this academic discipline in every aspect of it. And that's what it is. It's an academic discipline. It's a science. It's a way of understanding the way that humans interact. Um, and so maybe I actually know something about this. You call it nuanced, and I get that because not everyone spends their life studying this topic. What most people know about religion is what their parents told them about religion. Um, but just because it's nuanced doesn't mean that it's not valid, or it's not a kind of a firm foundation upon which to build not just knowledge about religion as a phenomenon, but also a deep and meaningful spiritual practice.
Well, let's move this conversation to a little bit more of a spicy direction. Before we go to the spicy direction,
spicier than religion, huh?
Spicy.
Spicier
Yeah,
than
I mean,
religion.
I thought this was pretty
politics happening
spicy.
in the
I'm just
world.
saying, this almost
And
pretty
you talk
spicy
about
to me.
politics too. But I want to start. You are probably one of the most prolific people to have personalities in Western media who has literally engaged in cannibalism. I just have to understand how that fucking happened. How did you get to the
how
place
did that happen?
where
I
you
was
just
like, I
you
read it, I was
stood in
like,
a
no
tribe
way.
and you just ate a person? I just need to know that story.
Wow. So one of my deep fascinations in the study of religion is what we refer to as lived religion, and what like normal people call religious people, because like you can study religion, like, oh, the institutions and the theology and the history and the scripture, but nobody gives a shit about that. Like, religious people don't know their own scripture. They don't know anything about their history. Christians barely know, let alone read the Bible. Same is true of Muslims and Jews. I mean, people just like, religion is kind of how they negotiate the world around them. And so I've made a career of kind of immersing myself in other, sometimes strange, religious communities around the world. And one of those communities is a group, a kind of extreme Hindu sect called the Agori. And the Agori are beautiful people. They're really, truly beautiful people. But essentially, I'll do the fastest version of this, which is that a fundamental part of Hinduism is a concept of purity. That's where the caste system comes, which a lot of people have heard about. But the difference between the different castes, from the Brahmin at the very, very top to the Dalit, or the untouchable, at the very, very bottom, is a matter of purity, right? The more pure you are, the less defiled you are by like the world and like sewage and whatever, like dirty things and all of that stuff, the higher your reincarnation until you become Brahmin, or the lower until you become literally what we refer to as the untouchable. The Agori is a beautiful 200-year-old sect in Hinduism that rejects that entire premise, like a foundation of Hindu ideology, just rejects it fully.
Okay.
And says that nothing can defile a person if God lives in that person. And so part of their missionary work is that they tend to take part in spectacular public displays of defilement. So they will, for instance, cover themselves in shit, or they will like sleep on burial grounds, like on top of bones and stuff. And a corpse is the single dirtiest, most defiling thing in Hinduism. A dead body. And yes, one of the things that they do is that they eat the dead. And I, as part of my sort of immersion in this community, to get to know them, to understand their language, to get to speak their language, right? I think of myself as a linguist. So this was like, study abroad. Like, I'm going to go learn French. Well, I'm going to go learn Agori. Part of it, in part of the initiation, was that I had to eat the sort of brain matter of a dead person. I don't recommend it. Please, don't do that.
Did it taste good at
But
least?
was it yummy? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the same question. Was it yummy?
Well, people ask me this question all the time. But if I were to be perfectly honest with you, so the dead in India are cremated. And so what the Agori do is, when everyone leaves, they go into the cremation sites and they gather what's left, the things that didn't burn. So they'll bring like the skulls and stuff. And so it tasted like charcoal. I mean, that's the best way that I could explain.
So no, it wasn't that yummy.
It was not yummy.
That does not sound yummy.
I also want.
Go ahead.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I've done other pretty crazy things too. I got to be honest with you. So.
Now, you were supposed to have a show. This was 2017 called Believer on CNN, and you got in trouble.
Well, I did have. I had one season.
Yeah, and then they got canceled, right?
Yeah.
But you got canceled for calling Trump a piece of shit and saying he's a man baby. And are you a little bit salty and annoyed that you kind of got in trouble for saying what everybody wanted to say?
Everybody does say that. Hell, I say that.
Yeah, but you didn't say it in June of 2017.
That's fair.
Which is when I said it. 6 months into his administration, when even perfectly rational people were like, just give him a chance. And in any case, yes, he might be a narcissistic sociopath, but you have to respect the office. You have to respect the office. You have to respect the office. Meanwhile, this guy is like shitting on the office. But like, we have to respect the office. And yes, it was at a time in which there was a terror attack in London on a bridge over the Thames. And while the British were still retrieving dead bodies from the river, like before anyone knew what had happened or what was going on, the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, tweeted, "This is why we need a Muslim ban." And I responded, "You are a piece of shit." And in my defense, he's a piece of shit. But also,
I agree with you 1,000%. There's no.
Also, as I had been told many, many times by very smart people, if I had just waited a couple of more months, then no one would have cared.
No one would have batted an eye.
A couple of months after that was Charlottesville. And post Charlottesville, all those people who were like, well, you got to give him a chance. And, you got to respect the office. After Nazis are...
Whose accent are you mocking?
I don't know, but I'm loving it. It's worth it. It's worth it.
My liberal friends. My liberal friends is who I was mocking.
Okay.
But I was ahead of the curve, I guess.
You were ahead of your time on that one topic, definitely. I mean, I do think that if you'd waited a few more months, you probably would have been okay. Because definitely now everyone's going, yeah, he's a crybaby man child. Like, of course.
I mean, this is very clear. Yeah,
it was clear from the beginning. But especially with what's now going on politically, and especially the war that's happening in Israel right now between Hamas and the Israeli government and the terror attack and all that's going on. I know you've written a lot of articles about that, and there's a lot of news from videos from people that you've talked to, like Douglas Murray, who have moved much further to the right today, really attribute this violence to Islam specifically.
Okay.
Where do you see the interplay, not just between socioeconomics, politics, and things like that, but texts themselves without like any type of reformation having an effect on this? Politically, do you think there is an effect? Do you think it's just hot noise? Do you think it's just blaming? Where do you think it comes from? Do you think there's a connection?
Look, if you want to blame Islam for the actions of Hamas, fine, as long as you're willing to blame Judaism for the wholesale slaughter and destruction of 14,000 people in Gaza by the Israeli government. So go ahead. Or if you want to blame Christianity for the launch of the war on terror, if you want to do that, that's fine. If you want to blame religion for acts of violence by religious people, go ahead. Just all I ask is be a little bit more even-handed about it. Okay, you got to just blame all of it. You can't just be like, no. Just this one religion is the problem. Everybody else is fine, but just this one religion is the problem. And by the way, if you want to blame religion for acts of violence carried out in religion's name, I'm cool with that, as long as you're willing to blame every ideology for acts of violence carried out. If you're willing to blame nationalism for fascism, if you're willing to blame socialism for communism, if you're willing to blame, for Marxism, if you're willing to blame atheism for Maoism, then
I think we can. I would agree that evangelical Christianity, the American version of Christianity, has a major part to play in George Bush's foreign policy. I don't even think it's a question. I think it's clear as day that it has a role. You don't think it has a role to play in it?
No, it does. I think it's much more than you think it is. This was a war this was good versus evil, not a police action, an investigative action of a terror cell. That's not what the crusade against evildoers that George Bush launched on September 12th was, right?
Yeah.
and again, I could come up with a million different examples of this. The point that I'm trying to make is, I think it's very easy to just blame the other for acts of violence, in this sense. Again, it's disingenuous for all the reasons that I mentioned, but also it doesn't really help the situation in any way. The conflict between Israel and Palestine, this 70-year conflict, is not a conflict over who loves God the most.
No, it's not.
This is a conflict over land and resources. And as we very well know, in the United States, the most religious country in the world, in the developed world, religion has a lot of currency with the masses. It can motivate people, especially desperate people. It can rally people to a cause or to a person. It is the language that has the most potency. And so, yeah, of course, it's going to be, used in order to promote, political or economic agendas. But to say that what's really happening in Israel Palestine right now is a religious conflict is frankly stupid.
Yeah, I think I agree that in the instance going on here, it doesn't. I don't think there's that much of a religious interplay. I think the Palestinian the people of Palestine, they're in a desperate situation and they're in a difficult situation. I don't know. I know there is some interaction between the religion like Zionism and how that's playing on that side of things. But it seems like you're saying something about like a wholesale. You have to take it all or nothing, and I just don't. I have to give you some pushback there because I don't think that you have to be all or nothing. Like there's definitely ways in which like I would blame Christianity for the behavior of Westboro Baptist Church. They go to all of these sort of funerals, protests. Then they're at the Pride Parade here in my city every single year. They say the most derogative, evil things, and I think a lot of that does have its roots in Christian theology and what they believe. And I think that you can hold religions accountable to some degree. And I'm curious, what do you think is the relationship between people's behavior and their religion, and like what kind of responsibility does religious doctrine have for the behavior of its proponents?
Oh, such a good question. Yeah, look, the church that I would go to would say that Westboro Baptists, they're not really Christians. And the mosque that I go to would say those Hamas terrorists aren't really Muslims. And the synagogue that I go to would say that those radical settlers who routinely slaughter men, women, and children in the occupied territories aren't really Jews. Okay, but who gets to decide that, right? Like, who gets to say who is and who is not a Christian?
And that
Who
comes
is
back
and
to a
who is not?
previous part of the conversation. You mentioned that part of this is that structure. Who gets to decide what the metaphors are? That's a
Right.
very
There's
interesting. There's
lots
a
of, yeah,
tie in
exactly.
there.
Now, of course, that thing has fractured into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller institutions, right?
Hmm.
Each one with the power to sort of define who's us and who's them, and they're not really Christians, but we really are, et cetera, et cetera. You're absolutely right. But it goes down to this other kind of real fundamental truth. And I'm glad that you asked that, because I think so often, particularly non-religious people, tend to think of religious people. They tend to think that the relationship that religious people have with their scriptures is kind of like, those old IBM computers, right? Where you had that little card, and it had, dots on it, and you push it in and then it does the outcome. That scripture is an algorithm, and the believer is the computer, and they open up the scripture and they read what it says, and then they go and do what it says. That's not how it works. It might be how it works in sort of the imaginations of certain people, but it's just fundamentally not true. It's not true for a whole host of reasons, not least of which that every scripture in the world is full of competing and contradictory messages. The same Hebrew scriptures that said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, also says, slay every man, woman, and child who does not believe in Yahweh. The same Jesus who said, turn the other cheek, and if your neighbor doesn't have a cloak, give him your cloak, also said, I have not come to bring peace, I've come to bring the sword. The same Quran that says, if you kill one person, it is as though you have killed the whole of humanity, also says, slay every idolater wherever you find them. Okay, so what do you do? Which one do you listen to? How do you incorporate your scripture? The fact of the matter is, and this is very counterintuitive and it's sort of hard for people to swallow, but it's absolutely true. People do not derive their values from their scriptures.
I've
They
read that.
insert
It's the other way around. Yeah, it's the other way
into
around.
their scriptures. Exactly. We
But-
go into scripture, which is nothing but words. It doesn't mean anything until someone encounters it. The meaning comes from that encounter. If you're a violent person, you will be drawn to the violent part of your scripture. If you're a peaceful person, you'll be drawn to the peaceful part of your scripture. If you're a woman, you'll be drawn to the more feminist parts. If you're a man, particularly a particular kind of man, you will definitely be moving towards some of the more misogynistic parts of it. Who you are has everything to do with how you read your scripture.
That's an interesting answer. I want to give you some pushback here because there's a relationship usually with language that it does actually sort of color the way we see the world, and sometimes it's literally coloring the way we see the world. There's a tribe that can distinguish between certain codes of green so much better that I was looking at it and it's like it looks like identical colors, but there's actually two colors to it, and the reason they're able to specify and see the difference is partially due to their language. So there's this relationship where language can literally color the way you see the world. But you seem to be saying that religion is the opposite of this. So wouldn't that be disconfirmation or of some kind, or at least evidence against the theory that religion is a language?
I don't think I've said that it's the opposite of it. Quite the contrary. What I'm saying is that the scripture doesn't have any power until someone gives it that power. It itself is just words on a page. That's all it is.
So let me just get, you're saying that the scripture isn't the language itself. The religion is the language. Right. Scripture is one way to justify your position.
Exactly. To your point, that's a really. I'll give you one very cool example of this, which is that Jesus and all of his followers spoke Aramaic. Some of them understood and probably spoke Hebrew. None of them spoke or understood Greek. And yet, the entirety of the New Testament is written in what? Greek. So, why is it written in Greek? Well, who speaks Greek? The Romans speak Greek. Non-Jewish Romans are the primary speakers of Greek, although Hellenistic Jews who lived outside of the Holy Land, their primary language was also Greek because they lived, in a Greek-speaking world. And Greek, as anyone who has studied it will tell you, it's a language that allows for a lot of philosophical grayness, right? There are ways to talk about God in Greek that are almost impossible to talk about in Hebrew or Aramaic. And so what we call Christianity is fundamentally a Romanized, Hellenized religion that arose out of a Jewish milieu, but it's not Jewish. And so to your point, right, how language can fundamentally affect the way that you even think, the way that you see the world, that's a perfect example of it when it comes to religion.
That is interesting.
Well, Reza, we are at an hour's time, and I know you said you have to go make dinner. So last words, what are you working on? What is something where people can find you? Is there something that you're working on?
You can't find me anymore. I
can't find me anymore.
After 2017, you deleted it all. You're like never touching this ever again.
I did. It was kind of like a sort of an experiment. It's been 13 months, almost 13 months, that I deleted all of my social media. And listen, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell you, but I'm the happiest I've ever been. That's all I can.
Social media
Well,
just contributes to so many terrible things.
The happiest and the healthiest I've ever like mentally been. Like I don't even know. Like I'm not gonna be an evangelist for it, but so you can't find me anywhere.
But what are you working on, though?
I'm working on a couple of books and a couple of TV projects,
Okay.
and I'm very very excited about it. I'm writing a book for kids, and then I'm writing a novel, and then I've got a couple of TV projects that hopefully will be announced soon. And look, I don't really care what kind of writing I do. I'm of the belief that there's really only two genres of writing. There's good writing and there's bad writing.
Okay.
So whether I'm writing a book or an article or an op-ed or a kid's book or a TV show or whatever it is, it's all just writing to me. And what I'm interested in is using my writing to communicate in interesting and educational, but also mostly entertaining ways. These things that I find really, really fascinating, which is like, faith and religion and the way that we think about ourselves and our place in the universe and the soul and these questions of like identity and humanity. Those things like turn me on. I mean, I'm a geek. I can't help it. They turn me on.
Yeah.
And I've always thought, there we go. And I've always thought that if I could figure out a way to communicate those things in an interesting and entertaining way, they'll turn other people on too.
If nothing else, I share your mission. That's part of what I want to do. That's why I'm doing all of this, is having these conversations and finding ways to communicate high level things in a way that everybody can relate to. For now, we really appreciate you coming out. I think I've been lost.
Yes. No, he did get lost.
Oh,
but
yeah,
thank you so much for coming on. And it was a pleasure speaking with you. And we'll not hold you for too long.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We need to be able to have conversations without feeling like we're going to say something that gets us thrown in jail because people happen to be offended.